Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We will begin shortly. Welcome again to this webinar we're hosting in collaboration and co-sponsorship with the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey. Welcome again. My name is Gati. I'm the project coordinator of this center, and I'm here to introduce our webinar for today. This is session 1 of Enhancing Mental Health Services for the Hispanic and Latinx Community. Session 1 titled Palante, Fostering Resilience in Latino, or Latinx Mental Health. This webinar is being presented by Dr. Jesly de la Cruz of the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events that our center is providing, we ask that you please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up using the bit.ly link provided on the screen, and I will share it in the chat box with you as well. Following this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform our future activities. The surveys are also important because our funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint presentation in the next couple of days. This presentation was prepared for the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. Please do not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. At the time of this presentation, Marian Delphin Bridman served as Assistant Secretary for the Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of the HHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so we ask that you please use the chat feature to answer them. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. This includes language that is strength-based and hopeful, language that is inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, language that is healing-centered and trauma-responsive, and invites individuals to participate in their own recovery journey, language that is person-first and free of labels, language that is non-judgmental and avoids assumption, and language that is respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. Just as a reminder, all participants will receive a certificate of completion, a link to access the Zoom recording and presenter slides, posted on our website within 7 days of this webinar broadcast. I would like to also introduce our co-sponsor, the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey. They were founded in 1999. The Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey is committed to addressing the mental health needs and well-being of the Latina, Latino, or Latinx communities by supporting mental health professionals across all disciplines through the advancement of training, treatment, research, mentorship, and advocacy. To this end, the association will promote, provide, and participate in ongoing interprofessional competence, interagency collaboration, and community engagement. On your screen, you can also follow the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey through their social media handles or by scanning the QR code that you see on the screen. They also have a YouTube channel, and all of this will be included in the slide presentation that you will have access to. And if you'd like to join as a member, they have also listed the perks of membership, which includes access to their listserv, discounted rate to programs and annual conference, networking opportunities, and fostering a sense of community. And they also have some upcoming events. For instance, the webinar series with our center, the Mental Health Association of New Jersey, our networking event, the annual conference, which is scheduled for February 2023, and additional webinars that will be announced. Now we have with us Dr. Jesly de la Cruz as our presenter for this first session. Dr. de la Cruz has a bachelor's in political science from Rider University and an MSW from Rutgers University, and her doctorate in social work, again from Rutgers University. Dr. de la Cruz is a licensed clinical social worker, and she completed a postgraduate certificate in family therapy at the Multicultural Family Institute in Highland Park. And having originated from an underprivileged background and being a child of an immigrant family herself, Dr. de la Cruz's education and work has been motivated by her desire to support traditionally underserved populations. Towards that overarching goal, she has worked with Latino advocacy nonprofit agencies. She currently serves as executive director for the Latino Action Network Foundation. Her clinical experience includes providing emergency screening of persons in mental health crisis at an inner city hospital, outpatient and in-home child and family therapy, and clinical consultation for nursing homes with primarily Spanish-speaking residents. In addition, she has extensive experience working in the prevention of child sexual abuse by conducting forensic evaluations, individual, group, and family therapy at an intensive outpatient program for court-mandated youth who have been sexually abused and/or have fire-setting behaviors. Currently, Dr. de la Cruz coordinates the psychological treatment of child abuse survivors and their non-offending families in Hudson County, New Jersey. As a practitioner scholar, her research interests focus on systemic approaches to the prevention and treatment of sexual abuse and the healing of intergenerational trauma in families through the use of mindfulness-based psychotherapies, play therapy, multisystemic family therapy, as well as political empowerment of Latinos in the state of New Jersey. Again, I want to welcome everyone, and I will turn it over to our presenter, Dr. de la Cruz.
Thank you, Katty, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today. Seeing in the chat people from all over the country and maybe even the world. I think there's some places outside of the borders that are participating, and I'm really grateful and honored to have this opportunity to share with you all my thoughts, my experiences, and some perspectives regarding Latino mental health and ways that we can enhance services for them. So I'm going to share my slides. So we're definitely going to be using the chat today. And I'll just make sure. Okay, we're just going to leave it like that for now. So we're definitely going to be using the chat today in regards to some question prompts that I have, or we're going to be doing a guided exercise. My camera won't be on the whole time. But this presentation is called Palante, Fostering Resilience in Latina, Latino, and Latinx Mental Health. This is accumulation of presentations that I've done and kind of culminates all the work that I've been doing around Latino mental health in the last few years. This is going to be focused a lot on strength-based perspectives. And really, I started talking about resilience theory several years ago at the height of the Trump era, where we, Latino communities were constantly being attacked daily on the media. And, started talking with my colleagues about the impact of that on our psyches as practitioners, as people from that community, and how can we address that and help overcome that and buffer ourselves from that stress. So these are, so I started to look into resilience theory, so that a lot of that, what I'll be talking about today, will be focused on that. But I want to get into exactly the workshop description, right? The workshop description for today is identify and discuss the barriers that prevent members of Hispanic and Latino, Latina, Latinx communities from seeking and accessing mental health services. So actually at this point, I'm gonna turn off my video and you can focus on that, because I'd actually like you to start using the chat and kind of give some free word associations or thoughts when you pull out these just specific words about barriers, prevention, access, and seeking. And in your work with Latino mental health every day, what comes to your mind if you were just to think of these words? Lack of access, trust, fear, language barriers, time barriers, language, safety, transportation, misunderstandings, fear, shame. Okay. Childcare, absolutely. Trust, language barrier, transportation, cultural. Yep. Stigma. Yeah. Right. So, yeah. So today we're definitely going to be focusing on all of these issues that are happening at the same time as someone's mental health condition. Right. So, someone could be coming in for, hyperactivity or, depression or anxiety. And we're trying to figure out how to treat that at the same time as these barriers, things that prevent people from seeking and accessing services, right? So actually, I'm actually going to stop my share and focus solely on my camera right now, because I'd actually like everybody to guide everybody through what I call meditation, right? It's a experiential. So I am trained also as an EMDR therapist, and we use bilateral stimulation, which is a tapping exercise. And you can do it at any pace. And I prefer a slower pace for this one, because I really want us to slow down our thinking when we're talking about mental health services with Latino communities. Often we're in this rush of trying to get people's needs met, their treatment plans, their care, their schedules, our own lives, and COVID, pandemic, the internet. And for this discussion, I really want us to imagine and create a positive experience. So I'm going to ask that those who can, hopefully you're not driving or doing, passively listening, but to kind of close your eyes and kind of start into a slow tapping. And I'll be here modeling just so that you enter this learning space with an open mind. Because as we're talking about enhancing mental health systems, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to think of a mental health system that is strong and that is strong enough to support the needs of Latino communities, right? And what that would look like. Maybe not a system, but maybe a program. Then I want you to imagine this system or this mental health program to be a two-way system where Latino communities can enter and influence the environment in which they're being treated, and where those who work in the mental health system or program also collaborate with communities outside of their doors. And what that would look like in your mind, in your imagination. I want you to sit with that. Then in this mental health system and program, I want you to imagine a mental health system that is fluid enough to address the changing needs and mental health risks of Latino communities. And I want you to focus on your specific community, your neighborhood, your practice area. Okay. Now imagine how it feels to work in such a system or a program. I want you to tap that in. Okay. I want you all to stop. And what do you guys notice, or what came to your mind? What kind of systems, what kind of creations, and hopefully, and if this is something where you want to take notes or draw a picture, this is definitely some more right brain activity for you to imagine a system that works for communities as opposed to how to figure out how to get communities to fit into systems, right? Because often we're doing the latter and not the first one. Cheerful reminder, but yeah, you may actually look forward to going to work, right? Inclusivity, champions inclusivity, multicultural components, equity, open doors, right? And not all the services might be happening in a building, maybe they're happening out in a community. What that would look like, a need for help, right? It's almost hard to imagine a system that outside of all that we know. But I really want you to think about how these thoughts and ideas shape the way that you practice, and if whether or not the limitations of the systems in which you work in actually inhibit your ability to enhance services for mental health clients, for Latinos in mental health practice in your practice, and what kind of resources and supports you think mental health professional need who could utilize to better address the needs, the systemic needs of Latino communities. So often when I'm talking about Latinx mental health in social work conferences or trainings and continuing education, it's always lumped into kind of this cultural awareness and social diversity, right? And that's really frustrating to me because to me, I often get frustrated how cultural competency or sensitivity is always an afterthought to whatever it is that we're doing. Right. But if you're practicing from, for example, myself, I'm a bilingual mental health professional that is practicing always from an anti-racist lens. And that to me, not taking into consideration the context is actually dehumanizing somebody. Right. So to me, this is at the heart of self-determination. So when you think about your mental health practice, rarely are we thinking about how are we undoing the impact of racism and oppression. And if we really want to think about how we're going to enhance services and have dialogues around this, there are things that I'm very open to talking about. Basically, how structures impact how structural racism impacts people and Latino communities, how people impact systems, right? And how we can impact systems to change. Those are conversations I love to have, or any complex ideas that involve solutions and equitable informed solutions that involve community dialogue and community-based approaches, right? And voices from the community. What I believe is unproductive to talk about is discussions that place responsibility on those most marginalized for why they do not access services. Okay. So when people talk to me about, oh, there's a lot of mental health stigma among Latino communities, they just don't want to do that. No quiero ver el loquero. Like, that's not for me. To me, I know of that phenomenon, but to me, that's almost like victim blaming. It's almost like saying they do not want to access this system because there is something wrong in their cultural beliefs that prevents them from accessing this system. As opposed to, do we have a mental health system that was created for this community? And we don't, right? we have a structural system that is based off ideas and diagnoses and treatments, that the majority of the research is not fully inclusive of our communities. I mean, discussions of racial trauma are still not in the DSM, right? So how do we do our mental health practice ethically if we're not looking at systems, right? And we're only looking at what clients don't do. So some of the learning objectives from today, at the conclusion of this presentation, you'll be able to identify resilience theory, its components, and its relevance to your mental health practice. We're going to talk, integrating this, some of the psychosocial challenges for Latino communities and its implications on their mental health. We're going to talk about some practical applications of resilience theory in direct clinical services to combat minority stress. Critically evaluate our role as mental health professionals, which we've already kind of started to do a little bit through these guided exercises to really think about the meaning and effectiveness of our clinical theories and research, and identify ways to work together to challenging and resisting reductionist narratives in clinical practice with Latinx mental health, specifically ideas around stigma. So I told you about the workshop description at the beginning. We're going to be talking about barriers. And to me, one of the biggest barriers we have is the lack of descriptive community-informed data, stats, and connections, right? So we're always trying to look at numbers, right? And what does our community look like, or accessing the services? But these are very difficult things to get. For example, in New Jersey, something that we're always battling is the lack of bilingual clinicians. And I feel like that's a nationwide problem, right? That we don't have a workforce to address the needs of Latino communities. And I always say, I'm not looking for Latino mental health practitioners, I'm looking for bilingual, right? People who speak Spanish and have the skills and desire to work with these communities. And there's always a gap, but it's hard to make a tangible ask of the government when we don't have information on how many licensed professionals speak another language in practice, right? So we would need the licensing boards to start to gather this information. Then we would need mental health services to actually start gathering data of people accessing their system, right? Like, what is the utilization of services by, and a lot of this becomes very muddied and difficult because the trickle down effect of the person at the front lines. Are they getting paid the equitable pay to do the job of gathering this data in an appropriate way and submitting it in a way that is seamless, right? Like, the technological structures within mental health services and how convoluted that often is. So I find this to be one of our biggest barriers, is what we don't know, right? The data and the stats and the connections that we don't have because we don't gather it. So when we want to talk about Latino mental health, how do we stay attuned to our demographics, given how dynamic and multifaceted, being Latino is not just one thing. And dynamics like, with politics and changes in migration and changes in policies versus like these kind of static, like how to work with Latinos in mental health, you know what I mean? But how do we remain attuned to data and getting information that's ever changing, and also knowing that it's not fully capturing our community for a lot of reasons, right? We worked very heavily in Census 2020 outreach to make sure that there was a get out the count. But when the president at the time put out that he was going to ask a question about legal status, immigration status on the census, that became a fear, right? It became a barrier as to even counting those in our community so that we know what the needs are in our community. So we have to really stay attuned, not just to the data, but the ways in which we are often left out of data and why that is. And these are policy tools, right? When we're talking about how to enhance mental health policy and how to advance that, these are simple advocacy tools. Start gathering data. Don't put fear in communities so that they don't participate in community surveys and community data. So how do we do that in a way that is engaging, that does not feel threatening? And also, how do we capture the heterogeneity within the Latino experience, right? Knowing what we know about the immigrant paradox, health paradox, where foreign born tend to be less at risk for mental health conditions as opposed to US born, and what that means. And being able to capture this information in real time. Because the numbers matter, right? So we talk about in New Jersey that, we are now 22% of the state population. And I'm not, and in each of your states and your locations, you would know, right, what that growing population looks like. So my question is, are we 20% of the budget? Right? Are our programs tailored to our community 20% of the budget, of the state budget? And typically they're not, right? So those are advocacy tools, and those are things that we need to kind of gather and organize in order to be able to use our voice to advocate for those issues on behalf of our communities. Because it's hard to talk about enhancing mental health services if we're not part of the solution as practitioners, right? Decisions often are being made for us, just like our clients' decisions are often being made for them. But we can change that. And sometimes it's hard to think about ways to do that outside of your daily practice. But your program reports matter, the data that you collect in your programs matter, and those can also become advocacy tools, as well as your success stories and the unique ways in which you provide services. When I think about Latino mental health, it's now 2022, we're 2 years fully into the pandemic. In New Jersey, things are starting to lift, but being that we were in a very serious hot zone, now we are in a world where we're talking pre-COVID pandemic and COVID pandemic and post that. Before the COVID pandemic, I was often talking about that these are the 3 leading causes of death among Hispanics: heart disease, cancer, and unintentional injuries. Unintentional injuries is such a blanket statement, right? Because this is almost predominantly mental health. We're talking about suicide, homicidal injury by domestic violence, murder, all these kinds of categories by which people in our community die. It's number 3 in our community we label as unintentional injuries, right? Which, to me is very minimizing and doesn't really reflect, well, why are so many people in our community dying by suicide and homicide? Why is that such a high risk among our community? And now during the COVID pandemic, what we're talking about constantly is the disproportionate impact on Latino communities due to their primary employment as essential workers, right? And being completely left out of any stimulus, a majority of community, a lot of the community being completely left out of stimulus packages because of their immigration status, or just difficulty in being able to get the documentation needed to be able to validate your income. If you're working under the table, if you're kind of not working consistently. But in New Jersey specifically, almost half of the deaths among people under 50 were Latino men. So essentially, we're dealing with severe grief, significant grief in our communities. And families being indebted, trying to figure out how to send remains back to their countries of origin, and community pooling of money, rearranging childcare, doing things from home, working as in grocery stores, retail stores, front lines, in healthcare, and what impact this has had on us. So disproportionate impact, all because of, not because Latinos are for some reason physically or biologically more prone to catching and dying of COVID. These are literally because of structural barriers that we lost so many people, right? Like I shared, we in New Jersey, we are 22% of the total population. So my question is always like, am I 22% of that state budget, right? And I want to look at that and ask the questions, why? Am I, if this is my local community, I'm like, is this 20, are mental health services or services for Latino communities 22% of the local county budget, right? Are resources being dedicated to our communities, and how do we advocate for that? And how do we get our communities to be invested in that? We're also a generally young population. Median age for NJ Hispanic Latinos is 31 years old. So primarily working. And this is something that I do when I'm working in mental health policy often, is I'm explaining the age range, the characteristics of the community, because there's a lot of myths out there, right? You know, I'm explaining, like, majority of Latino communities are working, they're contributing to our economy, right? They're supporting the basis of our economy. It's not like this criminalization. You have to beat these myths of criminalization and criminals and no immigration status and this and that. It's like, we are all very different. Right now, this is what we look like. And we all talked about some of the barriers. You all shared language access. And to me, this is a constitutional right, right? Like, this is a human right to be able to speak to your provider and for them to be able to understand you so that you get the care that you need. In the COVID pandemic, this was life or death. If people didn't understand all of your symptoms or all of what you were saying, or couldn't contact trace all the places that you had been, if we weren't able to do that, this is literally life or death. 80% of New Jersey Latinos speak another language at home other than English. And what does that mean when they're trying to access mental health services? Do we have clinicians? Do we have a workforce? Do we have a system that can accommodate bilingualism in mental health practice? Accessing coverage, actually, you know, having health coverage to access mental health services. In New Jersey, Hispanics are 3 times more likely to be uninsured than the general population. We're disproportionately represented in the uninsured, and you know, about half of our foreign-born population is completely uninsured, right? Having no access to care. So this is where we have to be creative in terms of funding and programs that people can access outside of their health coverage, but also that advocacy for covering all of our community, not just parts of our community or the parts that we think deserve care or coverage because of their employment, because of all these other things. So we work actively to, you know, do outreach and act and engage people to enroll in coverage, but also we have to do advocacy around covering all kids. That's something that we were able to pass recently in New Jersey, where now all children, regardless of immigration status, have access to healthcare, so that they can now see a mental health provider and get coverage for prescription medication. These are things that are policy issues that will disrupt somebody's entire life, right? So if you have a single parent who has a child with ADHD, an immigrant child with ADHD, and does not have coverage, you can't get childcare for them. You can't get daycare. You can't, how do you see a psychiatrist? If you see the psychiatrist, how do you get the medication covered? And this whole time, he's untreated and unmedicated and being disruptive in school, losing days in school, and the trickle down effect continues. So while we're always looking for direct practice ways, we have to sometimes shift our roles to think of these policy ways that we can better improve people's lives long term. So I do have a grassroots question prompt, right? Like, does your CMS, the Center for Medicaid Services, or your local mental health budget or governing board provide pay parity for additional languages spoken as a provider? Is there pay parity in your state? No. The answer is no, right? So this is a big advocacy tool. We've been talking about a differential rate in Medicaid reimbursements for bilingual mental health services, and trying to push for that. But that requires long planning and lots of organization. Now we use translators, right? So, and I always think about this because that has to be very difficult, right? And how you use translators. Like, do we even train people in mental health programs going to school for mental health how to conduct practice through a language line or through a translator phone or through a translator? Like, is that a class that everybody should take? Because anybody might encounter somebody who speaks another language in your practice, right? I think it's very important that we push the envelope within our programs, within our systems, to ask and to ask these questions, because otherwise they are being complicit with the problem. You know, when you think about accessing mental health services for Latinos, we have to think about the population, what those services might look like. 24% of New Jersey students from K to 12 in New Jersey are Latino. but about 62% of its Latino students and 66% of New Jersey's African American students attend schools that are more than 75% non-white. And because of this, there was a lawsuit filed against the state of New Jersey that there continued to be de facto segregation in New Jersey schools based off residential segregation, that children were limited to attending school only where they can afford to live. And being that segregation is very harmful to all communities, not just communities of color, but it negatively affects white communities as well. We believe this to be a mental health policy issue. Because one of the biggest problems with finding bilingual mental health professionals who maybe are native speakers or to become mental health professionals is that Latinos are less likely to complete their bachelor's and even less likely their master's and then later on their doctorates, right? So we have to ensure that our children have a pipeline to become whatever it is that they want, starting from kindergarten, right? Because it's hard to find mental health professionals to get MSWs or LCSWs or LPCs or, PsyDs if they're not starting on the same footing as everyone else. And we see this in licensure, right? Only about 11% of psychologists are Latino, 13% of social workers, and 12% of counselors. And of course, this is changing, but the numbers are still pretty low. And then accessing education is one thing, but then also accessing licensing is another. The rate of licensing among Latino students is actually lower on a lower rate than the general population. And this is research that we can share with the Council for Social Work Education. So then I have another question prompt for you. If we're talking mental health policy and how to enhance what services, what are the best pathways to strengthen workforce development in Latinx communities that foster resilience in mental health outcomes? Right? Because this workshop is much less about what policy looks like, but the tool I would like you to actually have the tools to go on and organize around some of these issues in your community to make some of these system changes. So something that we're always advocating for is, I think as mental health practitioners, we often have to advocate for ourselves, right? What our rate of pay is, what our service pay is. And I take that into the policy space, right? I would like to see dollars in terms of prevention. And when I think of the lack of dollars that go towards community-based mental health programs and initiatives that address the unique mental health needs of Latinx communities, that this is the pathway to prevention, but we don't do this as often or consistently or in a fluid way to address the changing needs. Funding is all, because this is a very touchy subject, to put funding elsewhere, that means someone else is not getting funding. So this is like at the heart of disrupting racist systems that do not equitably fund the needs in our communities. I want to take a little break because I've been talking for a little bit, and I just want you to sit with some of my favorite quotes. One of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou, which is, "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." Right. So we in Latino communities have faced a lot of adversity, often are experiencing a lot of changes, adversity with acculturation and immigration status, and just our regular system, our economy, the way things are set up in the pandemic that has changed pretty much all of us. But that we should not allow these barriers to stop us from asking for what we need. So now we're gonna get a little bit into resilience theory. I'm looking at the time. Okay, Caddy, how are we doing with time? Good?
We're doing very well.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a sancocho. I don't know if any or where everybody is from. If we want to drop some like identifiers, identity. I'm Dominican American. My parents are from Dominican Republic. I was born in the United States. So this is a meal that I ate a lot. This is called sancocho. It's a beef stew. It's a little un poco de todo, like it has a little bit of everything in it. And this is like the go-to for when you're sick or just need a little bit of like, not feeling well. My mom, it's funny, this is a perfect cultural image of this is and the issues that we face. Like my mom makes this all the time, like even in the summer. And I'm always like, why are you making soup in the summer? But in DR, they make this like, it's always summer in DR and they make this soup. So just me and her having that different cultural experience. But when I think about resilience, I think about how do we put things together so that people can be stronger moving forward for whatever next stressor or next developmental task they may meet. So when I talk about resilience, I'll talk about first what it's not, just like I talked about what conversations I'm open to having, what conversations I find very productive, but we're talking about resilience. We're talking about, we're not talking about the absence of psychopathology. So, having a mental health diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or PTSD does not mean that someone is not resilient, right? That they don't have the skills to overcome, that this is not nature, that this is not something you're born with, but something that we can nurture and foster and grow in community. It's not a static outcome, but a process, and it's everyday steps. We cannot guarantee what life will look like. In clinical supervision, I am telling clients all the time, because my primary clinical practice is in sexual assault, in the treatment and prevention of sexual assault. I explain to people all the time, like, we are all one chronic illness, one crime, victim of a crime, one tragic incident away from a mental health condition, being diagnosed with a mental health condition. This can happen to anyone. We are not, we often have to carry this fallacy as practitioners that we are resilient from experiencing harm. But as we know during this COVID pandemic, is that we are all vulnerable to stress. And if we compile that stress enough without enough buffers, that we can deteriorate our mental status, right? So our mental health. So the idea that, someone's having a relapse or an issue again means that they're not succeeding in treatment. Those are very complex ideas because we must move as life moves, right? So someone might be stable, taking their medication, attending their programs regularly, and then they have a major loss, right? Who hasn't had a major loss during this pandemic and relapse and into previous negative adaptive coping skills, So we want to work always from a place of curiosity, of knowledge, of humility, and of self-awareness as to our own vulnerabilities, and sit with our clients, not from this place of paternalism and kind of moral judgment. Resilience is this ability to leap back. I'm kind of also checking in the dash that keto is successful dishes, having the ability to combine the ingredients very similar to the integration of other cultures. Yeah, that's a great point. That's exactly it. So what is resilience, right? So current research definitions, this is from 2015 on. This is on a lot of psychotraumatology journals. It's basically the ability to leap back, the ability to withstand difficult conditions, right? And we could talk a lot about that, right? Like when I think about working with sexual assault survivors, like, do I really want them tolerating victim blaming? No, right? We don't want them to tolerate just toxic negative behavior. But how do we give them the skills to kind of bounce back from that, where their psyche is not harmed? And that might look like some of the skills that we give them, right? How to speak up for yourself, how to set boundaries, how to have communication, sit down talks with people so that they understand you. So some of the things that we facilitate kind of do foster resilience. The research also shows that it's a role of mental processes and behavior. So things that we think and things that we do, the ways that we talk to ourselves, which is why I was up in arms about all this media stuff and Latino communities, because we are listening to these messages. We are taking that in. We must be very conscious of our words and the ways that we talk about people, and how we do this to protect ourselves from the negative effects of stress. There's some definitions that I'm not too crazy about. Like, again, I'm always questioning things, kind of this definition of having a stable trajectory of healthy functioning after a highly adverse event. I often question clinicians in supervision about what is stable to you, because I think we come from this world, which is, very protective. It's very protective to kind of be like, oh, my life was normal, right? So whatever I went through is stable, and whatever is outside of the scope of what I know is unstable. Right. So growing up with no electricity, or bills being cut off, or food, fridge is not always being filled with food, is that stable? Because those elements were, or not even having a stable housing, those elements were all in my childhood, right? And the many are part of the lives of our clients. So would we consider them unhealthy based off something that they, have but so much control over, where they can work, their skill level to find a job, our economy, how they can get to that job, whether they speak the language for that job, whether they have the time to take the ESL course to get the better job, with childcare, with a mental health condition, with a DCP&P worker. Like, we have to be very conscious of the real time in which our clients are living their lives, and suspending judgment, right, as to how we think healthy functioning looks like. And actually, like, what you call a highly adverse event. Were the lights being turned off when I was little, a highly adverse event? Not, depending on how many days. You know what I mean? Like, and it's humorous now that I can talk about it, but these are the kind of things that sometimes, as we change social locations throughout our lifetimes, we can sometimes become disconnected with, when working with our clients. And how do we help clients reintegrate into their self? So kind of like the sancocho mentality, how do we bring all these kind of like this negative experience, these positive experience? How do we help foster new positive experiences through clinical work, through mental health services? I think about all the family sessions and the dialogues that we hold space for clients to have, that improve the trajectory for their bond over time, and how we can help facilitate more of that stability in people's lives and healthier sense of self. So there's really two things. If you want to work and think from a resiliency theory standpoint, right, like informing theory, using theory to inform your practice, there's two things. We talk about protective factors and promotive factors. When we talk about protective factors, these are the things that decrease the risk of exposure to stress. These help people buffer from the negative impact when facing adversity or in crisis. So like when risk is the highest. So in mental health practice, this would be, suicide, suicidality, being the victim of a crime recently, having a recent hospitalization. How do you help buffer people during times of high stress, right? What are the protective factors that we have? Have we walked people through how to call the hope line, how to call the suicide line, letting them know that people, when they answer, people can speak Spanish? Is that actually true? How do people actually speak Spanish when they call these lines? And are we putting people in places and spaces where clients are able to access the service they need when risk is at the highest, when they're experiencing a recent or active, potentially traumatic event? So basically, this is like all our safety planning. How do we do this with our clients? Resources for housing, resources for immigration support, resources for caregiving, respite care. These are all programs that we can think of that would be really helpful to someone. Does someone have supports for childcare in case they have to be with another child in an ER? So all these kinds of supports. And then promotive factors, to me, this is like the game changer. Protective and promotive factors is like, protective factors to me is like somebody wearing a helmet when they're riding a bike and they fall, you're trying to prevent a severe brain injury, right? But how do you teach someone not to fall so often when they're riding their bike? So how do you help people manage everyday stressors in ways that they are is actually strengthening their psychological processes and systems, right? So maybe things that, to me, something that's very promotive is participating in a mental health service where you're kind of learning some new thinking techniques, learning more different ways to communicate with your child, increasing your insight and awareness to your own difference in beliefs from that of your child around maybe sexuality or race and ethnicity, just having those spaces to talk. And the 5 themes in resilience building techniques is muscle memory. So this is like practice. So, when I work with child survivors of sexual assault, we do this activity where we practice saying no, we practice screaming no, we practice pushing, saying no. Then, we practice all these kind of survival techniques as ways to kind of reinforce that and so that it stays in their muscle memory. Another way to build resilience is definitely recognition, just acknowledging that people matter, walking alongside people. So when clinicians are like, how can I spend 2 or 3 sessions talking about how they got to this country? Like I spent an hour today talking about their immigration journey. And I'm like, that's very healing. That's very, very healing, because you are walking alongside someone in their journey to get into the country, to be where they are in this space to you right now, right? This is the human side of our treatment. And how we box that into treatment goals and diagnoses is like the secondary. We'll figure that out later, but that is the work, right? Is to listen to the stories of Latinx communities, of how they got here, how long they've been here, how are they feeling here, and you're walking alongside them and in essence building community and this undivided attention. When I think about kids and they say, I'm sure their parents ask them, kids, oh, how was your day? But is the parent really listening to how was your day? Or does the kid even feel like he can really say how his day was? So this kind of undivided attention where we're not looking at our phones or disrupted in other spaces, that we're actually just having one-on-one attention to clients, recognizing them does foster resilience. And talking about the past, I'm sure we all saw Encanto and we're equally moved by that. Every time I see it, I have a different experience. But this talking about the past actually builds a stronger sense of belonging. So definitely red flags, right? When you think about PTSD, when people avoid talking about things in their past and what that's about, right? Those kind of broken pieces to their puzzles, and how we can help foster resilience so that they feel safe and strong enough to talk about their past and their connections. And resiliency for generations. So the research also shows that parents who promote a positive ethnic identity can better prepare children for discrimination and potentially buffer the impact. So having dialogues around culture, around cultural identity, and how parents can relay that to their children so that they have a positive ethnic identity can help buffer them from the main risk that we're talking about, the immigrant health paradox, where our first generations here are US born, are experiencing substance abuse and mental health conditions at much higher rates than the foreign born. So this to me is like so important, right? How do we have programs that are centered in our cultural sharing activities? This is definitely a technique of anti-racism, where we do culture shares, where clients bring in items and materials related to their spirituality, their native country, their personal family cultures and practices and traditions. These are some personal notes. And when I think about policy, these are the themes that often drive a lot of the work that I do. I always think about, I know that I am a child of an immigrant, but I grew up in a very different time as a child of an immigrant than I did now. While I did experience my parents being undocumented at different points throughout my childhood, there was a pathway to citizenship when I was younger. And back when I was younger, it was called Immigration Naturalization Services. And then post 9/11, it became Immigration Customs Enforcement. So we went from a naturalization service to a criminal service, right? To criminalizing immigration services. So I think that's a big theme that really changes experiences for current Latino communities coming to the United States, and how this fuels, because it's so criminalized and it's policed in these very racist ways, how the challenges and the anxieties that mixed status families feel at the thought of being separated because of these issues, or even coming into your service and feeling like that might happen at your service, being picked up by immigration or ICE. the acculturative stress on relationships. You know, I always become so concerned when I see children who cannot speak to their parents in Spanish. Um, and you know, and I feel for parents who just struggle so much to kind of pick up the little bit of English that they can while they're working and doing all these things in real time. And how what that means for relationships and attachment and bonding. I feel like we don't know enough about that, and how can we help families that are experiencing these acculturative stressors, and diverse cultural experiences among clients, right? You know, when I think of this current generation, you know, wanting to be called Latinx, or wanting, you know, non-binary, ask me for my pronouns. And parents must be just so confused as to how to even connect with their children who are living in this very different world, where they're empowered to speak this way. And of course, language access to even explore their psychological experiences with someone who's trained and empathic, and has this anti-racist approach, and isn't over-diagnosing or pathologizing someone's experiences, right? That we need to really shift all of our systems to be able to do this better. So I know we all want to do, you know, CBT, MDR, all these fun clinical things, which I love doing. But it's also very important that we step out of our comfort zone and look for community resources and integrate that into treatment, so that we help immigrant clients buffer from stress. So I have in the past watched like Know Your Rights videos, like from American Friends, does like these kind of educating how to know your rights, like how to act in case you are in the middle of an ICE raid. And we play that out, right? Like we do muscle memory around this. We're like, okay, I've sat with kids and I'm like, okay, so what if your mom gets picked up? Have you talked about this? If your mom gets picked up for immigration, what is the plan? So have we talked about that plan? Do we need to bring in your mom for family therapy and talk about this plan? What that's going to look like? What's your fear around that? We have these terrible conversations, you know. To me, it's equivalent to Black families that have to talk to their child about how to behave when they encounter a police officer. These are ethical responsibilities in mental health if we want to work from a resiliency, anti-racist standpoint, right? Is actually helping buffer people from the systemic challenges they may experience based off our current policies and practices. So when we think about seeking and access issues, you know, we're talking about decolonizing our therapy, right? And we're not talking about, well, how do we get Latino communities to come to our building or to come to our service? And in my head, I'm like, what does your building look like? Where is it? You know, is it actually meeting the needs of the community? Are you trying to box people into a service, right? So if we were to actually create policies and a mental health policy to enhance services, we would construct systems and practices that are welcoming to Latin immigrants. And I want to take this back to our exercise that we did in the beginning and what that looked like. If it's like, if you didn't have those chains, what would your programs and your mental health services look like, right? My strong sentiment is that it'd probably not be fee for service. Right? They would not be fee for service. They would not be only limited to like a 45-minute session, when this is asking you to do a lot more, right? Working from this standpoint, if you really wanted to address seeking and access issues, you'd have to revisit the way that programs are funded, the way things are reported, the diagnoses and the ways in which we treat things. I mean, I always think about people with psychiatric conditions, how traumatic it is to always have to go to an emergency room when you're in crisis. And what that must feel like. It must be like so shameful, like this shaming feeling of, oh my God, I'm here again with those bright lights and that hospital. It's like, talk about feeling sick, right? If you're sitting in an ER again because you need an adjustment to your medication, or you had a major loss and it's not working anymore, and now, you know, all these kinds of things. And it's like, when I hear that there are communities within New Jersey where people with psychiatric conditions can go to a community-based setting 24 hours to be psychiatrically screened, I think, wow, that is very trauma informed. And why isn't that in my community? Right? Like, why do they have those kind of dollars? And our community has to go to the ER so that they can move up the wait list. That's 3 months in their mental health center. Like, we have the same problems we have. I think we just have to think about creative solutions to buffer people from those adverse events of like what it's like to even come in and be told you have a diagnosis, like what that experience is like. And that we would have to move really from kind of these individual therapy billing per service per person, Galadeo, I don't know, you know what I mean, that they come in, we'd have to actually do like healing centered engagement where we offer clients opportunities to come in and say, hey, listen, what we need is an ADHD specific treatment center and program to help us with our kids that they're not getting along with other kids, you know, but that's coming from the community, you know, and how we can engage our clients and letting us know what are the services that they need and how can we shape then our mental health systems to fund those services. If we also want to address how to address seeking and access issues for Latino mental health professionals, we also have to be the kind of colleagues that stand up to our colleagues when they're talking about stereotypes and kind of this negative posture of clients, you know, challenging myths and dialogue with students and peers and colleagues. You know, when I have a student who is Caucasian, who is white, and I asked them, did you talk about race yet with them, race and ethnicity with your client? And they're like, no, why would I have to talk about that? I'm here to treat them for their sexual assault. And I'm like, whoa, you know, what do you mean? Like you're having this person come in and talk to you about like the worst thing that's ever happened in their life, and you're not even going to acknowledge your differences. Like, why should she trust you? You don't look like anybody she's typically been able to trust, right? So we have to really challenge our students and our peers and our colleagues to have dialogue that is productive, particularly around diagnosis and stigma and medication. You know, when people are always like, oh, the reason they're still depressed is because they're not taking their medication. And in my head, I'm like, okay, where's all this research that all this medication works for depression? Because last time I checked, a lot of this medication is done by the pharmaceutical companies that produce these medications. So why is that the answer be all to everything? So just being able to challenge these discussions and have these kind of difficult discussions with our colleagues would have to be the first way that we show up. You know, talking about immigrant mental health and the role of immigration status, you know, this is essentially almost like you're not supposed to be a person. Like even the word undocumented is like as if you do not exist. But the impact of this and what this does on our communities must be integrated. And even how do you write about this when you're talking about somebody's anxieties and their fears or their paranoias? Like how do you document in your practice, and do you have tools in your office to document, you know, having stressors associated with immigration legal issues? Or do you have resources in your communities to support families like this? Does your agency do things to support families like this? So I'm going to kind of skip that slide because I'm taking a look at the time. I haven't been able to look at the chat, but folks who prefer Latinx, prefer this is acceptable. Latino, yeah, I see that there's a lot. So I'm going to try and, because I'm looking at the time and I'm looking at my slides and want to make sure I get through everything. When people ask me about, oh, well, what's the best intake form to use with Latino immigrant clients? I always say, you know, start basic with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I call this actually the am I a person assessment? What is your access to good air, clean water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, you know, kind of all these physiological needs, your safety needs, your love and belonging. And that will give you a real good sense of what kind of mental health stressors your client is experiencing. And also how resilient they may be, right? How many clients are experiencing gaps in their basic physiological needs, but still able to have their safety needs met, or not having safety needs met, but still feeling other places and still being able to be resilient and overcoming things. I also, when I think about assessment, when clinicians are coming in, they're like, okay, I want to present this client. I'm like, okay, do not present me a client like starting with their problem, right? If you're not locating them for me, I don't even know what you're talking about, right? So always working from this intersectional mental health perspectives, that we push this understanding that yes, we are treating psychological conditions. Yes, we are treating diagnoses and using evidence-based practices, but we are treating people. And you cannot separate people from their family system, from their community, from their cultural identity, that these, life is not happening in a vacuum, right? All these things are happening at the same time. And if you fully assess this, and even the language that they use, when a clinician tells me, I asked the client if they were straight and they said yes. And I'm like, okay, that is not the way to ask that question, right? You need to use language, because someone could be living as straight and not be straight, right? So you really want to be mindful of the language that you're using, and even the demeanor that you have in there. And you say, well, so many Latino families don't feel comfortable talking about this. Okay, well, how can we figure out how to bring it up? Because it matters. It matters. It matters to their child. We don't want to make assumptions, and we don't want to further participate in this secrecy of not being able to talk about someone's full self, right? So their sexuality, their ethnic identity, how they identify with their race. If your client identifies as white, then let that be that they tell you that, not that that was what was assumed. So if we really wanted to address how to enhance mental health services for Latino communities, we'd actually really need to think outside the box and think about how do we resist the way services are currently provided and funded, and talk about how we collectively organize to inform the best ways for Latinx immigrants to access mental health services. So how do we do this in our everyday practice, right? How do we show up? Which in supervision and clinical supervision, in our research, in our education, and then go further out into our local and state initiatives and our budgets, right? The dollars coming to our community, and with our licensing boards and our, the NASWs and the NJPAs and the APA and the American Association of Counseling Services, like what are they doing, and are we holding them to task? You can take some of these other grassroots organizing prompts and think about some events you can kind of gather with some of your colleagues, or even just in your agency, and just ask these questions like, do you have a lot of colleagues who are not native English speakers having difficulty passing their licensing exams? And if you're seeing a pattern, then maybe this is something that we should talk about with our licensing boards. How can we address licensing boards to, first of all, gather information in languages spoken, and how do we support professionals to get their license through mentorship or funding, tutoring, and ways to be able to support that mentorship and support the clients that professionals need to become licensed? Is it accessible to potential candidates who represent historically marginalized communities in their region? Why or why not? And how can you facilitate a pathway for more BIPOC mental health clinicians, specifically clinicians who are linguistically, ethically, and culturally trained to work with Latinx immigrant populations? So, and those who love them, like how do we help people enter this field from the community to do this work? Right. And what's our role in that? So I'm going to give a little example of something we recently did in New Jersey. I wear another hat where I am executive director for Latino Action Network Foundation. We're an advocacy group that works with a 501c4 on basically, we believe that all issues are Latino issues, and we use our voice collectively to influence social policy. So about a year ago, we partnered with about 20 mental health professionals in the field, and even some consumers from across the state. And we developed a mental health report and findings. And we found that, these issues were pervasive. We've done this is our second time at this report. 15 years later, we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues and actually worse because of the fee-for-service model and because of the parameters around the pandemic. We looked at workforce development. How do we create pathways for bilingual professionals? Community education outreach. How can we create programs and get funding for programs that support maybe some paraprofessional health, some promotora kind of programs in mental health in the community, to talk about grief, to talk about therapy, to talk about all these different issues and do maybe those kind of soft skills to encourage people then as a pathway to entering mental health practice. Cultural and linguistic competencies, really calling to task state boards and funders to use the class standards and rate their RFPs based, ensuring that the agencies that they fund have staff that looks like the community that they serve. And if not, what is their plan to serve the community at large? And this is important when we start going and talking about data and our conclusion and our next steps. So with this report, which is available online, if you look it up, and the links will be provided, we had a 1.5-day roundtable. We did invite the Division of Mental Health Services to present, and they shared with us their initiatives, and we were able to collaborate with the state and actually get some practitioners to participate in as community stakeholders on different projects and programs and rollouts with the Division of Mental Health Services. So it was successful in ensuring that we have a partnership, a dialogue, a communication. We work at testifying for their budget hearings. So, and then working in collaboration with other groups to make sure that our policy issues are included in the budget and on the agenda. So, I mean, essentially we have to, if you're not invited to the table, we tend to create our own table. Is pretty much what we did, but then we invited them to the table, and then we make sure that where our issues are being heard. Some of our workforce development recommendations, of course, we're funding pathways for bilingual master's level licensed practitioners, enhanced rate and Medicaid budget for bilingual mental health services, providing residency and fellowship funding for bilingual psychiatrists, and training Latinx individuals as higher education educators for counseling professions, because we noticed a large gap in learning from people who look like you and can influence the field. So, and we also talked about creating incentives for programs to do co-location of services. So, mental health agencies that are able to partner with local churches and social service organizations to provide off-site services, that this would increase engagement for Latino communities. Looking at anti-stigma social media campaigns. And I know I take a big stance on stigma, but then in my head, this is an effort for the state to make an effort to show how they are providing services in a way that makes people feel welcome. So this is kind of where you have to be at the table, because we're promoting this and we're advocating for this, but I really want to see what that anti-stigma campaign looks like and what it says, and what it's telling our population about what mental health stigma is and mental health treatment, what that looks like. We were able to successfully advocate for our promotora program. It does not yet have the approved Medicaid rate, but it is able to provide some community-based mental health support around gender violence for women who have been experiencing this at higher rates during the pandemic. So actually, out of our advocacy and organizing work, we're able to get some funding for these initiatives through collective action, through collective voices. Increasing bilingual and bicultural school-based mental health programs. There are current campaigns in New Jersey geared towards counselors, not cops. So reducing the funding for security and police in school systems and rechanneling that funding towards school-based mental health programs that also talk about race and ethnicity and cultural issues and have bilingual school mental health programs on site. Implementing peer-to-peer strategies, which we believe is kind of part of that promotora program, and of course, enhancing digital access to care. Looking at the time, it's 1:17. So our next set of recommendations were around cultural and linguistic competencies. So we asked that, the licensing boards and the consumer affairs start to gather information on languages spoken by clinicians, something we're still working on with their governor's office and with the licensing boards. Just asking them to use the class standards as a rating system for their RFPs so that they're funding agencies that represent the community. Language abilities of those contracted on staff, that they should mirror, again, the community, that they have these things in place. Increased representation, which we were actually able to do on planning boards and task force for agency boards. And that actually the Division of Mental Health Services start collecting and sharing demographic information on their utilization of services based off race and ethnicity, also what their dropout rates were by race and ethnicity. This led to our participation in the 988 rollout and the Atlas group, Project Atlas. We're rolling out these programs in New Jersey. We're currently working on creating a BIPOC mental health coalition work group throughout the state that kind of continues to have a voice and represent these issues in policy arenas. We're currently working on budget advocacy. So these are basically just resources for you to have on file. I've actually been using this diverse and equitable language guidelines from APA a lot and doing presentations just around language a lot around for clinicians and different community programs. I find it to be really helpful. So also, having information about know your rights as an immigrant and local agencies that support that work. So that is pretty much the end of my presentation today. And I really want to thank you all for listening. I'm really hopeful that you gained some information and some food for thought and planted some seeds for action steps. I think that if we want to enhance mental health services for Latinx communities, we have to be fully present to push forward an agenda that make sure our needs are being met and that agendas aren't being set for us. So I want to thank you and thank Caddy for providing me this platform of radical ideas and to share these thoughts with you all today. And gracias.
No, thank you, Dr. De La Cruz. Muchas gracias a ti. And thank you everyone for joining us. We're currently in the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you'd like to stay for that portion, you're welcome to do so. We do appreciate your time. Before you leave, I've also included a link to our evaluation. And I included that in the chat. So just want to say thank you so much, Dr. De La Cruz. The comments in the chat are just wonderful, and they're so encouraging and so thought-provoking as well for many, because they didn't see mental health in that way before, and your message also resonated with many of our participants. We do have some questions and we do have some time. So the first question that I received was, how would you recommend navigating the complexities of diversity within the Hispanic and Latinx population in the mental health setting?
So how would we navigate just having discussions around how diverse these experiences are?
Yes, the complexities and the diversity of the nuances of so many Latin American cultures.
Oh yeah, that and then yeah, you're right, absolutely. And I mean, it's almost just as simple as like I have to explain to people like Latino means a lot of things. There's a lot of countries. When you say something simple like we become Latino here in America. And just explaining that idea alone to someone is like, wait, what? It's like, yeah, no. And when you're from Guatemala, you're from Guatemala. When you're from Argentina, you're from Argentina. And if you're from Argentina, you might have Polish or German descent. And if you're Dominican, you might also be Jewish. I mean, these things can be so complex, but just explaining to someone that our identity becomes reduced
Yeah,
merely by entering in the United States, right? We,
absolutely.
right? We are, it becomes one thing, it becomes one title. And this is a title that actually we fought for to have, because we wanted to be recognized, because otherwise they were, in the census, they were identifying Latinos as white, but without white privilege, right? So that kind of informal segregation that was still happening. So I know that the term is oppressive in this way because it lumps us all together, but it's an identity that we're forming here, so that we can do advocacy work together, across our differences. So I think just even having those conversations about, people from Brazil are in Latin America, and that what are we even as Latino groups really engaging in that community? So,
Mhm.
I just think sharing experiences helps. Cultural shares are important. Just having opportunities where people can share culture in the office, and with your staff and with clients works. And actually, I hope everybody tunes into the next webinar with
Yes,
my friend, Dr. Asara Santiago, who is actually going to really provide you a lot of information and tools to have those discussions.
wonderful. Thank you. Our next question that we received is regarding acculturation and how it relates to resilience. Can acculturation foster more resilience?
Oh, absolutely, right? Resilience is like every time you've mastered something difficult, and another step in that is empowering, right? That empowers you for the next step. So in acculturation, just those feelings of, hey, I'm learning to take this public transit regularly here. I'm learning how to access the service. I'm starting to meet other people in my community. I'm starting to, hear music and experience culture and life in a different way here.
Mhm.
That when people are able to do this safely,
Mhm.
that is empowering.
Absolutely. And a lot of feedback that we receive from members of the Latinx community is that they learned how to multitask, they learned how to be resourceful, they learned how to think outside the box, thinking of new innovative ways to navigate the complexities in acculturating to the mainstream society as someone who may have come from a different country. So I think a lot of times that is also a muscle in resilience. Here's another question that we received was how to provide person-centered, culturally appropriate services and in the meantime uphold a professional boundary, the ethical professional boundaries, let's say in each a professional realm, whether it's social work or counseling or being a psychologist, in terms of the touching a patient, a client, or hugging a client. How would you recommend navigating a situation like that?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Those awkward conversations, I think I have those skills that as a play therapist that I do narrate a lot of what I do. So I just think having conversations with your clients about maybe why we may not engage in the common Latino hug and kiss at the beginning of a session or anything like that. But if it happens, like how to address that, right? Like if a client leans in, how do you address that to show them? I think we have to share cultural norms. So, right, we might want to explain to them that as a professional, I'm not able to do that, but how to do so in a way that is with humility and also respect, right? Um, but I don't know. The more I've practiced over time, the more in the gray I am. I think honestly, I think that you have to have a very strong sense of self to be able to talk about these things, and you have to do a lot of work on yourself. So I did a lot of work on myself in family therapy training, about my own racial identity and privilege of being a white Latina, like all these kinds of things I've spoken about. But I've had to address racism with clients, like I am Dominican. So when clients are like, oh, but you're white, and I have to explain, okay, yes, there are Dominicans look like a lot of things. We're not a stereotype. So, having to address those things, I feel like it's my right to do so. And it's my responsibility actually to kind of address those things. So my ethical boundary is usually placed on that my silence can be complicit in allowing someone to carry on a stereotype that I know is harmful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And here's our last questions. I'm also being mindful of the time, but I just want to also acknowledge all of you who are still with us. We have a large amount of participants still with us, and I really want to thank you. And the overwhelming feedback, positive feedback that we received in the chat. And many are still asking of how to get in contact with you. So I will follow up with all of you with Jesse's contact information. And everyone will receive a copy of the slides as well as the link to the recording if you'd like to share this with your colleagues. Here's our last question. How to work with families? How does a practitioner or a professional work with clients where mental health is viewed as, and I use in quotes, being possessed by an evil spirit, and remain respectful of the family belief system?
Yeah, I learned something really. I had a colleague who was a psychoanalyst. He was Latino. He was a Spanish-speaking psychoanalyst, and he taught me something that I found very valuable, because I said, how do you practice in a theory that is so like not inclusive, right? And you're so good at it. Like, how does that work? And he said often that when he encounters these cultural issues, that he talks about the distress of it and how to cope with it, as opposed to how to negate their belief. Right. So I think that sometimes when you are so disempowered, when you've been living in severe, dire circumstances, there is this kind of feeling of helplessness that it's like, there has to be a bigger power. There has to be something bigger than me to either get me through this or causing this, because of the powerlessness that people often feel in their own lives based off either their upbringing or their social locations. So it's just finding ways to help people feel empowered to address their symptoms and address their distress in ways that don't really minimize their beliefs, right? Their religious beliefs or religious or cultural experiences. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you so much. And again, I want to extend a warm thank you to Dr. Dela Cruz for providing us with this wonderful webinar today. I see a question in the chat. Yes, everyone is going to be automatically enrolled in session 2 and 3. As mentioned before, your one-time registration and automatically enrolls you in sessions 2 and 3. So you should be receiving a link. If not, please contact me directly. I'll put my email in the chat. Here we go. So again, I just want to say thank you. We hope you enjoyed our webinar for today. Again, thank you, Dr. Dela Cruz. The feedback we receive is so enriching, and it's so comforting to know that so many understand the situation that we're in terms of mental health services. And we hope that you have found all of the content provided today relevant and useful in your work. And hopefully I'll see you on April 13th, session 2. And if not, please email me and we can send you a link to the recording. This webinar will also be recorded and posted on our website. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you continue to stay safe and well. Bye-bye.